From ABC News, around the world and into your home, the stories that touch your life. This is 2020.
Thanks for joining us tonight on 2020. I am your host, Barbara Walters, and today we are looking back at an infamous period in history, the Cuban Revolution. The movement that overthrew Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista and his regime began in 1952 with a failed coup attempt and ended when the 26th of July movement successfully occupied Havana. This revolution eventually established a revolutionary socialist government just below the border of the United States during a turbulent, ideologically sensitive Cold War period. The trigger of the Cuban Revolution was the attack on the Moncada barracks in Santiago, in which Fidel Castro and his brother Raul were participants. They were captured and sentenced to prison. This event brought international attention to the dissent against Cuba's dictator. In 1955, due to political pressure, the Batista regime freed all political prisoners in Cuba. The Castro brothers were exiled to Mexico, where they prepared for the revolution. It was in Mexico where Fidel Castro met and collaborated with Che Guevara, renaming themselves the 26th of July movement. In 1956, the Castro brothers and Guevara launched another attack on the Batista regime, but failed due to organizational issues. However, they managed to escape and relocated to the Sierra Maestra Mountains, where they began to develop support from the peasants. This event launched the 2-year guerrilla war between the revolutionaries and Batista's troops. In 1957, a separate group of revolutionaries, composed mostly of students, unsuccessfully attempted to assassinate Batista. Due to this, the United States imposed an economic and arms embargo on the Cuban government, weakening Batista's power. At this point, Batista's support among Cubans began to fade, and former supporters began to join forces with the revolutionaries. The successes led to Guevara and Castro to begin their own offensive, and they slowly began to capture several towns. The news of continuous defeats caused Batista to panic and flee Cuba on January 1, 1959. The revolutionaries entered Havana and met no opposition. After 6 years of conflict and struggle, the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista was finally over. Now, with the knowledge foundation of the movement as a whole, we would like to take a more focused look at the youth aspect of the Cuban Revolution. We will hear from previous student activists, Castro supporters, and even Fidel himself. Let's take a look.
For all of us who lived through these events, we know what equality means. It is the right to many things, including the right not to have to fear terrorism and murder. We would feel dread during Batista's time when we saw the bodies of murdered students, our friends, on the streets of Havana. It was time for a change, and we as students had a duty to fight for this change.
On July 26th, I followed Frank Pice and fellow student supporters of Castro's revolution in an attempt to take Santiago. Our attack was supposed to happen at the same time as Castro's own triumphant return from Mexico, where he had assembled a small but trained military. We managed to capture government buildings in Santiago as well as a prison, but Castro was delayed, and without his support we were forced to retreat into the hills. Although we did not fully accomplish our goals that day, our efforts succeeded in bringing our fellow students' attention to Castro's cause, and they joined the revolution.
Students in Havana who were interested in political reform were involved with the University Federation of Students and the Revolutionary Directorate, led by José Antonio Echeverria. While those groups were anti-Batista and loosely affiliated with the 26th of July movement, they were anti-communist and acted independently of the Sierra Maestra rebels. On May 13, 1957, the FEU and DR members attacked the presidential palace in an attempt to assassinate Batista.
We stormed the building and engaged in an hours-long gun battle with guards protecting the president. Most of my fellow revolutionaries were killed, and I was one of the few survivors. At the same time, Echeverria and another contingent took over a radio station in order to broadcast a message of revolution. They were also killed by police forces. The subsequent state crackdown was one of the harshest of the decade, and we in the FEU and DR were left without leadership.
With us here tonight is Fidel Castro. Fidel, seeing the incredible impact the youth have made on the movement, why do you think they chose and adopted the revolution as their own?
I think young people joined me because they were sick of the old regime, and I promised them something new. In the old government, there was no development. The government put all their money into producing sugar, and Cuba was left with no funding for anything else. Many people were not able to attend school, and many youth were illiterate. People were not getting the medical care that they needed. There was room for progress and change, but Batista was not doing anything, and the youth were angry. Then I came along, this young leader who grew up as an illegitimate child of a poor farmer. I too was angry, and I provided them with a way to use their anger to change the government.
Thank you, Fidel, for your insight. The Cuban Revolution would never have succeeded without the overwhelming determination and support of the young students at the time. One of the greatest legacies of the revolution has been its impact on the youth, not only in Cuba, but all around Latin America. Castro's regime's major focus was on social advancements, especially in healthcare and education. Castro and Guevara had always focused on rallying the youth as vanguards of the socialist revolution. After coming to power, Castro maintained his focus on improving the social welfare of the youth, and one of his regime's greatest successes was vastly improving the access and quality of schooling all across Cuba. Throughout the 60s and 70s, there was a huge redistribution of income that was in large part due to the vast education and health reforms. The Cuban youth in the decades following the revolution had access to opportunities they could only have dreamed about before Castro, and this only cemented the youth's support of the revolution and Castro's regime. Despite recent failures of Castro's regime, such as sacrificed economic efficiency and restricted political freedom of its citizens, the Cuban Revolution came to stand as an inspiration to disaffected students around Latin America due to Cuba's success in outwardly defying the United States and focusing on social advances of its own citizens instead of economic growth. Throughout the decades following the Cuban Revolution, much of Latin America saw an upsurge in socialist revolutionary ideologies and guerrilla conflicts in response to the same social inequality and political repression that the Castros and Che had fought against. Enthusiasm was seen particularly in students. Today, although Cuba still places a strong focus on its social programs, the lack of economic growth has had a significant impact on the population, and the youth of Cuba do not have access to as many opportunities as those enjoyed by the revolutionary generation. As the revolutionary generation of Cuba slowly approaches extinction, one must question whether Che Guevara's idea of the immortal revolution will hold true and outlast the legacy of the Cuban Revolution. This concludes this week's edition of 2020. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.